He signed his own prescription, then never woke up to refill it. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Calling all sharp minds. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. Your words always breathe life into each mystery. Let's begin. The morning mist clung to the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead like a persistent spectre, curling around the chimneys and hedgerows as if reluctant to release its grip. The quiet stillness of the hour was shattered when Mrs. Weatherby, on her way to post a letter, stumbled upon a most peculiar sight. Dr. Leonard Ambrose, a well-respected physician with a reputation for discretion and a keen mind, was found slumped over his desk in his private study, the remains of a half-finished glass of brandy beside him. His skin bore a waxen pallor, his lips tinged with an unnatural blue. The heavy mahogany door had been locked from the inside, and the only window, though slightly ajar, showed no sign of forced entry. The scene suggested a man who had taken his own life, or met with a most confounding fate. The villagers, drawn to the spectacle with hushed curiosity, gathered near the iron gate of the doctor's residence. Constable Graves arrived, his face lined with concern as he waved away prying eyes and stepped inside. The housekeeper, a pale and trembling woman, wrung her hands. "He was fine last night, sir," she stammered. "Took his dinner as usual, went to his study. Said he had a few papers to go through before bed." Graves frowned, taking in the details. The room bore no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no sign of intrusion. A small open bottle of digitalis sat neatly beside the brandy glass, its label clear, a common heart medication, but lethal in excess. It seemed a simple case. Suicide or tragic accident. And yet, as Graves noted the placement of the brandy, the carefully closed doctor's bag on the floor, and the absence of any suicide note, doubt wormed its way into his mind. News of the physician's demise reached Miss Jane Marple over her morning tea, delivered with the usual breathless efficiency by her friend, Mrs. Bantry. "Dreadful business, my dear. Dr. Ambrose gone, found in his study. Poisoned himself, they say, though it all seems quite peculiar, don't you think?" Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime unraveling the darker threads woven through seemingly ordinary lives, listened intently, stirring her tea with deliberate care. "Indeed, it does sound most peculiar." She set her cup down with a quiet clink. "I think, dear Mrs. Bantry, that I shall pay my respects." Arriving at the doctor's residence, she was met with familiar, polite resistance from Constable Graves. "Now, Miss Marple, I know you mean well, but this is police business." "Of course, dear boy," she said pleasantly. "But you know, a fresh perspective never hurts." He hesitated, then sighed. "Just don't go touching anything." Miss Marple smiled benignly and stepped into the study. She observed everything: the careful orderliness, the faint scent of tobacco, the book left open on a side table. Her eyes flicked to the brandy glass and the bottle of digitalis. "Dr. Ambrose was a most meticulous man," she murmured. "Would he, I wonder, have misjudged a dose so fatally?" She moved closer, noting the small details others had overlooked. A smudged fingerprint on the glass, barely visible. A sheet of paper tucked into the blotter with a faint indentation. Someone had removed a note, and the brandy itself, untouched beyond the first sip. Her sharp blue eyes twinkled as the pieces of the puzzle shifted into place. "No," she mused to herself. "This was no accident, and certainly not suicide." Miss Marple turned to Constable Graves with an air of gentle finality. "You see, my dear boy, Dr. Ambrose did not prescribe his own poison. Someone else did." Miss Marple's statement lingered in the air, quiet yet undeniable. Constable Graves blinked at her, his jaw tightening with the reluctance of a man who had just been nudged toward an unsettling possibility. "Not suicide?" he repeated, as though testing the weight of the words. Miss Marple gave a kindly nod. It does seem rather unlikely, don't you think? A doctor, especially one as experienced as Dr. Ambrose, would hardly make such an error with his own medication. Graves shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the neat row of medical books on the shelf, their spines unbroken and methodically aligned. Accident, then? Perhaps, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Her hands, delicate but sure, smoothed over the edge of the desk as she examined the glass again. And yet, one must always consider what does not quite fit. She did not elaborate, but instead turned her attention to the small waste bin beneath the desk. While everything else in the room bore the hallmarks of careful order, the bin was unusual, emptied but for a single torn scrap of paper. She bent down, retrieving it with gloved fingers, and examined the faint ink smudges. The writing was clipped, precise, but incomplete. Cannot be avoided. Tonight, dangerous if... The rest was missing. Graves peered over her shoulder, his brows drawing together. Might have been nothing. A note he changed his mind about and discarded. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Or a note someone removed, though not quite completely. She straightened and moved toward the side table, where an open book rested, a collection of medical case studies. The pages were fanned slightly, as though someone had left it in a hurry. The passage on display detailed a rare but effective method of inducing cardiac arrest through carefully administered poisons. Miss Marple's fingers ghosted over the page. "Now, isn't that curious?" she murmured. Before Graves could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hall. A moment later, Inspector Crayford entered, his expression one of mild irritation upon seeing the village's most persistent amateur sleuth already at work. He was a broad-shouldered man with the weary air of someone who had seen too many cases and too few satisfying conclusions. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a thin smile. "I suppose it would be too much to hope that you've come merely to offer condolences." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of intruding," she said sweetly. "Only it seems such a curious case, doesn't it? Poor Dr. Ambrose, passing in such an unexpected manner." Crayford exhaled through his nose, giving Graves a pointed look. "We're treating it as a possible overdose. Digitalis poisoning. Whether it was intentional or not remains to be seen." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And do you believe that's all there is to it, Inspector?" Crayford's patience was thinning. "What exactly are you suggesting?" She gestured to the glass on the desk. The doctor had hardly touched his brandy. If he meant to take his own life, why hesitate? Crayford frowned. "That's not conclusive." "No, of course not. But then, there's also the missing note, the oddly placed book, the waste bin that has been emptied apart from one small scrap." She let the details sink in before continuing. A man like Dr. Ambrose, so careful, so precise, would hardly leave loose ends. And yet, here they are. Crayford's eyes darkened. "Are you implying he was murdered?" Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle yet firm. "I am only suggesting, Inspector, that one ought to look a little closer." Crayford sighed but gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. Graves, get someone to go over the room again and see if the housekeeper remembers anyone unusual coming by." As Graves hurried off, Miss Marple turned toward the door, where Mrs. Weatherby had lingered, peering in with the eager curiosity of a woman who rarely found herself in the middle of such excitement. Poor Dr. Ambrose," she murmured. "Such a gentleman, always so kind, and so busy. You know, just the other day he told me he had a patient he was dreadfully worried about. Said it was a tricky case." Miss Marple's ears perked. "Oh. Did he say who?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned, thinking. "No, only that it was someone he'd been seeing quite frequently." A shadow of concern crossed Miss Marple's face. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know its quiet rhythm, the habits of its people. Dr. Ambrose had always been methodical in his patient care, but few ever required such frequent visits. Most interesting, she said softly. Crayford, overhearing, made a note. We'll get his appointment book, he muttered. Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts had already begun spinning. Somewhere among the facts, a half-finished drink, a discarded note, an anxious patient, lay the truth. And if there was one thing she knew with certainty, it was that nothing in St. Mary Mead ever remained hidden for long. The following afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the small parlour of Dr. Ambrose's house, a cup of tea in hand as she observed the subtle interplay of human behaviour unfolding before her. Inspector Crayford, along with Constable Graves, had gathered several of those closest to the late doctor, his housekeeper, a few local acquaintances, and a handful of patients. The room buzzed with uneasy murmurs, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed firmly on the group. Mrs. Blanchard, the housekeeper, was the first to speak. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, her face pale from the shock of her discovery. "I don't know what to tell you, Inspector. I found him as you saw, just like that. I didn't hear anything strange during the night." Crayford leaned forward, pressing gently. "Did Dr. Ambrose ever mention anything unusual in the days leading up to his death? Any change in his routine?" Mrs. Blanchard's eyes darted to the door, her lips parting as if to speak, but she quickly bit them together. "No, nothing like that. He was very busy, as usual. There was a patient he saw quite often, but he never said who." "Never?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm yet persistent. "No, ma'am. I wasn't privy to the names of his patients." Mrs. Blanchard's voice faltered slightly, as if trying to avoid giving away more than she meant. "But he wasn't a man to entertain gossip, you see. Not like some." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I see. But surely in a small village like this, one might hear something." Mrs. Blanchard's eyes flickered to Crayford, but she quickly recovered, lowering her gaze. I suppose he did mention the one patient a few times. A man, he said, who was quite difficult to treat." Crayford made a note. "A difficult patient, you say? Was he receiving regular visits?" The housekeeper nodded quickly. "Yes, nearly every day, but never at regular hours. Always at odd times, late into the night, sometimes early in the morning." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, exchanging a brief glance with Crayford. The irregularity was curious and not the sort of detail one could easily dismiss. Before Crayford could press her further, a second figure stepped forward. Dr. Langley, a local physician and colleague of Dr. Ambrose. His posture was stiff, his face drawn with worry, though it didn't seem entirely genuine. He clasped his hands tightly in front of him, his voice measured as he spoke. "I've known Leonard Ambrose for years, a brilliant man. I can't imagine why he'd do such a thing to himself. It's not like him at all. We spoke just last week, and he seemed perfectly well." "Did he mention anything troubling?" Crayford asked, his tone professional yet insistent. Dr. Langley hesitated. "Not directly, but there was something strange about him recently. I don't know how to explain it, but he seemed more distracted, distant, as if something was weighing on him." "Did he share his concerns?" Miss Marple asked softly. Dr. Langley shook his head. "No, he didn't, not in any specific way, but it was clear he wasn't himself. He seemed, well, unnerved even, and that's not something I've ever seen in him before." Crayford leaned forward slightly. "Unnerved by what?" "I'm afraid I can't say." Dr. Langley's gaze flickered uncomfortably, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the tension beneath his calm exterior. His words were practiced, but there was an underlying hesitation, an unwillingness to divulge certain details. Miss Marple took a step back, mentally cataloguing everything. There was an air of discomfort about Langley, as though he were hiding something just beneath the surface. And though he spoke of his colleague with the expected level of respect, his unease suggested there was more to their relationship than he was letting on. Next, the doctor's last patient, Mr. Thomas Stratton, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, was ushered into the room. His face was drawn, and his eyes, though quick, seemed to avoid steady contact. He shifted uncomfortably as he sat down, clutching his hat in both hands. "Mr. Stratton," Crayford began, "you are one of Dr. Ambrose's regular patients, I understand." "That's right," Stratton replied, his voice tight. "I've been seeing him for some time now. Quite often, actually." "Could you explain why your appointments were so irregular?" Crayford pressed. Stratton's eyes darted, and for a moment he seemed taken aback. "Irregular?" "Yes, it's been noted that Dr. Ambrose often saw you at unusual hours, late at night, early mornings." Stratton's face reddened slightly. "Well, yes, I suppose that's true. But I had my reasons, of course. My work, you see. I travel frequently, and we had to make do with what time was available. Dr. Ambrose was very understanding." "And what sort of work do you do, Mr. Stratton?" Miss Marple interjected gently. He stiffened, his fingers clutching the brim of his hat more tightly. "I'm in the shipping business, ma'am. Very busy, very demanding. That's all." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. She could sense the small crack in Stratton's carefully constructed demeanor, the hurried pace at which he was trying to move past the question. "Mr. Stratton," she said, her voice low and measured, "do you find it at all odd that Dr. Ambrose would go to such lengths to accommodate you?" Stratton blinked, clearly startled by the question. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her eyes were sharp. "You seem quite defensive, Mr. Stratton. I wonder, was there anything in your relationship with Dr. Ambrose that might explain such urgency in his care for you?" Stratton's gaze faltered for the briefest moment. No, nothing of the sort. I simply needed his help. That's all." Miss Marple allowed a long pause to stretch between them, watching Stratton closely. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating the best way to salvage his story. She could also see the faintest hint of panic, as though he feared something would slip from his lips, something he didn't want anyone to know. "Tell me, Mr. Stratton," Miss Marple said, her tone softening, "did Dr. Ambrose ever mention his concerns about a particular patient? Someone he was worried about?" Stratton's face grew pale, but he quickly recovered. "Not to me, ma'am. I never heard him speak of anyone in particular." Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave him. "Very well, then. But you would agree, Mr. Stratton, that it is a curious thing that Dr. Ambrose should pass under such mysterious circumstances, wouldn't you?" Stratton's mouth tightened. "I suppose it is, yes." "Thank you, Mr. Stratton," Crayford said, signaling for the man to leave. As Stratton exited, Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Crayford. There was a thread here, thin and elusive, but it was beginning to unravel. Each person had their own version of events, and slowly, contradictions were beginning to emerge. Some too eager to cooperate, others too guarded. And the more Miss Marple listened, the more she could sense that someone was hiding something deeper than they were willing to admit. The next piece of the puzzle, she thought, would come from the one person who hadn't yet spoken, the doctor's secretive patient, but finding him would be no simple task. As the evening deepened over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, the warmth doing little to soften the cold puzzle in her mind. She had spent the better part of the day sifting through statements, each one revealing something, yet never quite enough. Dr. Ambrose had been a man of discipline and caution, qualities that made his sudden demise all the more unnatural. She turned over the fragments. Mrs. Blanchard, the loyal housekeeper who had hesitated just long enough to suggest she knew more than she let on. Dr. Langley, the colleague whose concern had felt just a touch too measured, his gaze flitting away at inconvenient moments. And of course, Mr. Stratton, the nervous patient whose visits had been so irregular, his manner shifting between defensiveness and evasion. Each of them had a connection to the late doctor. Each had their own reason for secrecy. But none of it explained the note. Cannot be avoided. Tonight. Dangerous if... It was not a suicide note. That much was certain. It was, rather, a warning, a message of urgency that had either arrived too late or had been deliberately silenced. Early the next morning, Miss Marple made her way back to Dr. Ambrose's residence, where Inspector Crayford was already engaged in sorting through the doctor's records. A man who had long been skeptical of amateur inquiries, Crayford had nevertheless grown, grudgingly accustomed to Miss Marple's insights. When she stepped into the study, he barely looked up. "We found his appointment book," he said, flipping through the pages. "Routine checkups, minor ailments, nothing that leaps out. But here..." He tapped his finger against a set of initials. "T.S." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Thomas Stratton." "That's what we assumed. He saw Dr. Ambrose frequently." Crayford exhaled, leaning back. "And yet we've no record of what exactly the doctor was treating him for." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "That is rather peculiar, isn't it?" Crayford nodded. "Medical records should have been kept, but there's a gap. His file on Stratton is missing." A silence settled between them, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Inspector," Miss Marple said at last, "I believe it might be time for a rather more direct approach." Crayford arched a brow. "With whom?" She smiled pleasantly. "With Mr. Stratton, of course, and perhaps a word with Dr. Langley as well." Later that afternoon they found Mr. Stratton pacing in front of his home, his expression drawn. When he saw them approach, his jaw tightened. "I've told you everything I know," he said, his voice edged with irritation. "Have you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. "It's just that we came across Dr. Ambrose's appointment book, and it seems you were quite a frequent visitor. More so than one might expect." Stratton hesitated, glancing toward the road as if contemplating escape. I had my reasons." "Which were?" Crayford prompted. Stratton hesitated before exhaling sharply. "I was ill, all right. But it was private business." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "You were being blackmailed, weren't you?" Stratton's eyes widened, his entire body stiffening. "That's absurd." "Is it?" she continued, her tone ever so gentle. "Dr. Ambrose was not only your physician, he was your confidant, and yet someone else knew something about you, something you feared enough to seek his help." Stratton swallowed hard. He stopped, looking down at the ground. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You see, Mr. Stratton, I've always believed that people reveal more through what they do not say than what they do. And you have been most reluctant to explain exactly why Dr. Ambrose took such an interest in your well-being." There was a long pause. Then, finally, Stratton exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he muttered. "Yes, I was being threatened, but I don't know by whom." Crayford folded his arms. "Start from the beginning." Stratton hesitated once more before speaking. "It started a few months ago. I began receiving letters. Someone claimed to know about an investment I made, a rather unwise one. He ran a hand through his hair. If it got out, it could ruin me. I spoke to Dr. Ambrose about it because I wasn't sleeping. The stress, you see." Miss Marple nodded. "And what did he say?" "He told me to keep calm, that he would look into it." Crayford's brow furrowed. "Look into it how?" Stratton shook his head. "I don't know, he wouldn't say. But the night before he died, I received another letter." He hesitated. "It told me to be at my house at 11, said that if I wanted the letters to stop, I had to comply." Miss Marple's mind whirred. "And did you?" "Yes. And no one came." Crayford's expression darkened. "So while you were waiting at home, Dr. Ambrose was dying." Stratton's hands clenched. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying." Miss Marple studied him, then turned toward Crayford. Inspector, I do believe our next conversation should be with Dr. Langley. They found him at his practice, seated behind his desk, reviewing files with careful precision. When they entered, he looked up, his face carefully composed. "Back again, are we?" Langley said smoothly. "Dr. Langley," Miss Marple said, her voice pleasant, "I wonder if you might explain something to us." He raised an eyebrow. "If I can." She folded her hands. "You and Dr. Ambrose were colleagues, were you not?" "Yes. And yet his death does not seem to have affected you quite as one might expect." Langley's fingers tapped against the desk. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I rather think you do." There was silence. Then Langley sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right," he muttered. Ambrose was on to something. He had suspicions about someone. Someone in the village. He didn't say who, but he was troubled by it. Crayford's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Langley shrugged. "Because I didn't think it was relevant." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "On the contrary, Dr. Langley, I believe it may be the key to everything." Langley looked away, tension tightening his features. "He told me he was afraid that someone might try to silence him." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "Inspector, I rather think we are dealing with a crime far more calculated than we first imagined." And for the first time, Crayford looked as though he truly believed her. The day after their conversation with Dr. Langley, Inspector Crayford received what seemed to be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. One of his officers burst into the station, breathless, holding a small, crumpled piece of paper. "We found this, sir," the officer reported. It was tucked inside Dr. Ambrose's waste bin, beneath a layer of discarded notes. Crayford took the paper and smoothed it out. The message, scrawled hastily in ink, read, "Meet me at the old vicarage. Tonight. No more delays." The note was unsigned, but what caught his attention was the smudge of ink beneath the words, as if someone had gripped the pen too hard, pressing their distress into the parchment. He didn't need Miss Marple to tell him that it reeked of urgency. Miss Marple, of course, had already arrived at the station before Crayford could send for her. It was a curious thing about her. She always seemed to know when something important was about to happen. She sat quietly as he relayed the discovery, nodding thoughtfully, though her expression remained unreadable. "It could be our killer," Crayford said. "Perhaps Ambrose was blackmailing someone, and when they were cornered, they struck first." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against the arm of her chair. "Yes," she murmured, "that is one possibility." That afternoon, they combed through Dr. Ambrose's records once more, and the old vicarage became the center of their focus. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its stone walls now partially overtaken by creeping ivy. If a meeting had been planned there, it was a place meant for secrecy. A constable arrived with another piece of news, an eyewitness account. A local boy, Peter, the blacksmith's son, says he saw someone lurking near the vicarage the night Ambrose died. Says they were dressed in dark clothing, hunched over, moving carefully. Crayford's pulse quickened. Did he recognize the figure? He wasn't sure, sir, but he said the man had a distinctive limp. The inspector's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, but she remained perfectly composed. A limp, a detail that pointed unmistakably to one man, Thomas Stratton. They found him in his cottage, the fire burning low in the hearth. At the sight of Crayford and his men, he paled. I don't understand," Stratton stammered. "Why are you here?" Crayford held up the note. "Recognize this?" Stratton's eyes flickered toward the paper. "No," he said too quickly. "You were seen at the old vicarage the night Dr. Ambrose died," Crayford continued. "A witness noticed your limp." Stratton's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words failed him. I did go to the vicarage," he admitted at last. "But I swear, I didn't kill him. Miss Marple, who had been watching him keenly, spoke for the first time. "Why were you there, Mr. Stratton?" His throat bobbed. "Because Dr. Ambrose asked me to be." "Why?" Stratton's fingers clenched into fists. "I don't know," he said desperately. "He said he had something important to tell me, that my troubles weren't over, but he had a solution. I arrived just before 11 like he asked. But he never showed up. I waited for nearly half an hour before I left." Crayford exhaled, shaking his head. "You were seen at the crime scene. You had a motive. He was helping you with a blackmailer, wasn't he? Perhaps you learned that he was the one extorting you all along." "No!" Stratton's voice cracked with the force of his denial. "I swear to you, I didn't kill him. Dr. Ambrose was the only person I trusted. He was trying to help me. But the case was too neat, the evidence too clean." Crayford arrested Stratton on the spot. News traveled quickly through the village, and by evening, St. Mary Mead was buzzing with satisfaction. The mystery, it seemed, had been solved. Only Miss Marple remained unconvinced. That night, as she sat in her armchair, knitting in slow, steady motions, her mind refused to quiet. A case should settle naturally into place, each piece fitting where it belonged. But this one did not. A note in the wastebasket, a place too obvious for a murderer to discard their message. A witness who conveniently spotted a limping man, and a doctor who had known he was in danger but still set up a secret meeting. No, it was all wrong. She thought again of Beatrice Fenton, the chemist, who had seemed overly eager to present information, and Dr. Langley, whose concern had not quite matched his words. There were too many loose threads. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. Somewhere in the village, the true murderer was watching, waiting, believing themselves safe. They were wrong. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm following Thomas Stratton's arrest. But Miss Marple was not at ease. Something about the case continued to nag at her, a faint whisper of unfinished business. The villagers, of course, were eager to move on, content with the inspector's conclusion. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that truth was rarely so neat and convenient. She sat by the window, staring out over the quiet street, the wool of her knitting slipping between her fingers as her mind retraced every detail. Dr. Ambrose had known something, a secret not just about his blackmailed patient, but something larger, something deeper. And then there was the note, the hurried scrawl of a man who had seen the end coming too late. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Beatrice Fenton, the village chemist, standing on the step, a look of discomfort on her face. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she said, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. "Not at all, my dear. Please do come in." Beatrice hesitated before stepping inside, her shoulders drawn tight. I suppose I shouldn't be here, but I can't quite shake this feeling about Dr. Ambrose." Miss Marple poured tea, setting the delicate cups on the table. "It is often wise to trust such feelings, my dear. What is it that troubles you?" Beatrice took a breath, as if gathering courage. "It's something I recalled about his prescriptions. A few weeks ago, he requested a particular compound, digitalis." Miss Marple's knitting stilled. Digitalis, a potent heart medication in the right dosage, a deadly poison in the wrong hands. Beatrice lowered her voice. It wasn't unusual in itself. But then, just days before his death, he came back and asked for a record of his past orders, going back nearly 20 years. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes lifted to meet hers. "And did he say why?" "No. He just seemed troubled. He kept checking the names of old patients, muttered something about a mistake needing to be put right." A mistake. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. "Miss Fenton, would you happen to still have those records?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "I do." Miss Marple reached for her coat. Then I believe we had best take a look." Inside the chemist's shop, the scent of dried herbs and antiseptic filled the air as Beatrice unlocked a wooden cabinet, revealing thick, worn ledgers filled with handwritten entries. Miss Marple ran a careful finger down the pages, scanning the names. And then she saw it. Her breath caught ever so slightly. A name from long ago. Eleanor Langley. She tapped the name lightly. "Tell me, my dear, what do you know of this woman?" Beatrice frowned. "Eleanor Langley. That was Dr. Langley's wife. She died nearly 20 years ago." Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the ink, thoughts clicking together like pieces of a puzzle. "Yes," she murmured. "I remember now." It had been a tragic case, whispered about in hushed tones at the time. Eleanor Langley had suffered from a heart condition, one that required digitalis. She had died suddenly. The cause ruled as heart failure. Dr. Ambrose had been her attending physician, but if he had been looking through his old records now, after all these years, it could only mean one thing. He had seen something he had missed before. The pieces fell into place with quiet certainty. Dr. Ambrose had discovered an error, or perhaps something more sinister, buried in the past, and someone had killed him before he could speak of it. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently. "Beatrice, my dear, you have been most helpful." As she walked through the village, the wind stirred the trees, sending crisp leaves swirling across the path. Her mind was already racing ahead. If Eleanor Langley's death had not been natural, then the person responsible had lived with that secret for years. And now they had killed again to keep it buried. There was only one question left. Who, after all this time, still had something to hide? Miss Marple returned to her cottage in deep thought. The revelation about Eleanor Langley's death had shifted the entire case, casting long shadows over the present crime. If Dr. Ambrose had only recently realized an old mistake, then his murder had not been about blackmail at all. It had been about silencing him before he could expose the truth. But what exactly had he uncovered? And who had the most to lose if that truth emerged? She needed to test a theory, and for that, she would need to set a stage. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Dr. Langley's practice, stepping into the crisp, antiseptic-scented air of his office. The doctor himself stood behind his desk, his usual calm demeanor intact, though Miss Marple did not miss the faint stiffness in his posture. "Miss Marple?" he greeted. "I admit I'm surprised to see you. I thought the case had been solved." "Oh, indeed, so it seems," she said pleasantly, settling herself in a chair. "Though I must say, I do keep thinking about poor Dr. Ambrose. It must have been quite a shock for you, losing a long-time colleague so suddenly." Dr. Langley pressed his lips into a thin line. "It was. I still can't quite believe it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And of course, it is not the first loss you've suffered." She paused just long enough to let the words sink in. "Your dear wife, Eleanor, all those years ago. Such a tragedy." Dr. Langley's expression remained carefully neutral. "Yes, a difficult time. I happened to be looking through some of Dr. Ambrose's records. Such meticulous work he kept." She continued lightly. "Did you know he had been reviewing your wife's medical files in the weeks before he died?" A muscle in Dr. Langley's jaw twitched. It was quick, barely perceptible. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime watching human nature reveal itself in the smallest of ways. "Had he?" His voice was measured. "I can't imagine why." "Oh, nor could I at first," she said with a slight smile. "But then, of course, I remembered the circumstances. Eleanor's heart condition, her sudden passing, and the digitalis." Dr. Langley's fingers twitched as he adjusted the papers on his desk. "Yes," he said evenly. "She required digitalis for her condition." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly, as if confiding in an old friend. "You know, it's the strangest thing. Dr. Ambrose was quite unsettled by something he found. He even mentioned to Miss Fenton that he suspected he had made an error long ago." Dr. Langley exhaled softly, his fingers stilling. An error? Oh, yes. She studied him carefully. Of course, he never had the chance to explain what he meant. Such a terrible thing, being silenced before one can set things right. A silence stretched between them, taut as a pulled thread. Then Dr. Langley smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple, I admire your keen mind, but you must understand. Grief does strange things to people. Dr. Ambrose was not a young man. If he truly thought there was some mistake in my wife's case, I can only assume he was mistaken himself. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Perhaps. But there's a funny thing about the past, Dr. Langley. It never stays buried quite as deep as one hopes. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for your time, Doctor. I do appreciate it. As she turned to leave, she saw it. Just a flicker of something beneath the surface. Not fear, not even guilt. Annoyance. Dr. Langley had not liked being reminded of his wife's death. Or rather, he had not liked being reminded that someone was looking too closely at it. Outside, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. The first crack had appeared, but it was not quite enough. Not yet. She had one last test to conduct. That evening she asked Inspector Crayford for a favor. It was an unusual request, but by now he had learned not to question her methods. The next morning, a quiet buzz spread through the village. An anonymous tip had been received at the station, suggesting that Dr. Ambrose had confided in someone before his death. That there was a witness. It was, of course, entirely fabricated. But Miss Marple had no need for a real witness. She only needed to see how the right person would react to the possibility of one. She did not have to wait long. By midday, Dr. Langley was seen leaving his practice, walking briskly down the road toward the chemist's shop. Miss Marple, watching from a nearby garden gate, saw him enter and, moments later, Beatrice Fenton's pale face through the window. A conversation took place, hushed and urgent. Then Dr. Langley left, his pace even quicker than before. Miss Marple smiled to herself. It was time to catch a murderer. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Langley disappeared down the road, his coat flaring behind him. The good doctor was rattled. There was no doubt about that, and his hurried visit to Beatrice Fenton had only deepened her suspicions. He was trying to cover something, to get ahead of the supposed witness before they could speak. But what had he hoped to accomplish? There was only one way to find out. Miss Marple waited a respectable few minutes before making her way to the chemist's shop. A little bell chimed as she stepped inside, and Beatrice, who had been tidying a shelf, turned sharply. Her face was still pale, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them together. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "Back again so soon?" Miss Marple gave her a kind, knowing look. "My dear, I do hope you won't think me terribly intrusive, but I couldn't help noticing that Dr. Langley paid you a visit just now. He seemed quite concerned." Beatrice swallowed, averting her eyes. "It was nothing, really. He just asked me some questions about old records. Wanted to be sure I hadn't shared anything that might cause unnecessary speculation." "How very diligent of him," Miss Marple said lightly. "Did he mention the supposed witness?" Beatrice's head snapped up. "So that wasn't true?" Miss Marple let out a small, apologetic sigh. "I'm afraid not. Just a little test, you see, and Dr. Langley's reaction was most informative." Beatrice's hands tightened. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. He asked me to destroy something." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Destroy what, my dear?" Beatrice hesitated, then turned toward the cabinet where she had shown Miss Marple the old ledgers. "The record of Eleanor Langley's prescriptions. He told me it was better if there was no confusion, that mistakes in old files could lead to unnecessary trouble." Miss Marple nodded, as if this was all quite expected. "And did you do as he asked?" Beatrice bit her lip. "No, at least not yet. But I don't want any trouble, Miss Marple. If Dr. Langley says it's a mistake, maybe it is." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "You're a sensible young woman, Beatrice, and I am very glad you waited. Might I trouble you to let me see the record one last time?" Beatrice hesitated only a moment before unlocking the cabinet and pulling out the worn ledger. She flipped through the pages, her fingers slowing as she neared the section they had examined before. And then she froze. "It's gone," she whispered. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The page where Eleanor Langley's records had been was missing, torn cleanly from the binding. The paper had been sliced so precisely that no casual observer would suspect anything had ever been removed. Beatrice let out a shaky breath. "I don't understand. I locked the cabinet after you left." Miss Marple looked at the cabinet door. "Is there another key?" "No, just mine, and I always keep it with me." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Then someone must have taken the page before you locked it." Beatrice's hands clenched. "Dr. Langley?" "It would seem likely," Miss Marple said softly. "He must have seen the book when you first retrieved it for me. He knew what he needed to remove." Beatrice's face darkened with anger. "And I nearly helped him do it." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. "Don't blame yourself, my dear. The important thing is that we now know how desperate he is, and desperation leads to mistakes." Miss Marple turned, deep in thought. The missing page was a setback, but it did not erase what she already knew. Eleanor Langley had been prescribed digitalis. Dr. Ambrose had revisited her case and found something troubling. And now, Dr. Langley had removed the one remaining record that could prove what had truly happened. But there was still one avenue left to explore. "If you don't mind, Beatrice, I should like to take a look at your supply records for digitalis. If Dr. Ambrose suspected a mistake, it might not be in the prescriptions themselves. It might be in the quantity dispensed." Beatrice hesitated, then nodded, pulling another book from the shelf. She flipped through the entries, stopping near the time of Eleanor Langley's death. "There," she said, pointing. "That was the last time it was ordered for her." Miss Marple leaned in. The dosage was correct for a patient with a heart condition, but the amount given was far more than should have been necessary. "Too much," she murmured. Beatrice nodded slowly. "Yes, but why would Dr. Ambrose have done that?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted with understanding. "I don't believe he did." A long silence settled between them. Dr. Ambrose had been a meticulous man. He would not have overprescribed without reason. If Eleanor had been given too much digitalis, it was not because of a mistake. It was because someone had wanted her to have more than was safe, and that meant her death had not been natural. Dr. Ambrose had realized it too late, and for that, he had paid with his life. Beatrice shivered. "Miss Marple, what do we do now?" Miss Marple straightened, her expression calm but resolute. "We let Dr. Langley believe he has succeeded. Let him think he's erased the past." Then her eyes sharpened. "And when he makes his next move, we'll be watching." As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly as she reflected on the day's events. The missing ledger page was a setback, but not an insurmountable one. Dr. Langley believed he had erased the evidence, but he had only confirmed his own guilt. It was always the case with those who thought themselves clever. They overlooked the simple truth that deception left its own trail. She was just about to set her knitting aside when a frantic knocking rattled her front door. Rising quickly, she opened it to find Beatrice Fenton, her face pale and eyes wild with fear. "It's the surgery," Beatrice gasped. "Something's happened." Miss Marple took a steadying breath. "What is it, my dear?" I don't know exactly," Beatrice stammered. "I was passing by and I saw the light still on. The door was ajar, which isn't like Dr. Langley at all. I went inside and—" She shuddered. Something's wrong. Miss Marple wasted no time. Gathering her shawl, she followed Beatrice through the quiet village streets toward the doctor's practice. The door was indeed open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Inside, the waiting room lay in eerie silence. A faint medicinal scent lingered in the air, but something else beneath it. Something metallic. Blood. Miss Marple's stomach tightened. Moving cautiously, she stepped past the reception desk and into the hallway. The door to Dr. Langley's office stood open, and as she approached, she saw the unmistakable shape of a figure slumped over the desk. Dr. Langley. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clapping a hand over her mouth. Miss Marple moved forward, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. The doctor's head rested awkwardly against the desk, his hand clutching at his collar as if he had been struggling to breathe. His skin had taken on a strange pallor, his lips tinged blue. Beside him, a glass lay overturned, the last remnants of a liquid pooling on the desk. Poison. Beatrice was trembling. Is he? Miss Marple touched the doctor's wrist, searching for a pulse. There was none. Dead, she murmured. Beatrice let out a soft, broken sound. Who would do this? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Someone who wanted to silence him before he could be exposed. The irony was not lost on her. Dr. Langley had murdered Dr. Ambrose to keep the past buried, yet now he had suffered the same fate. But the timing was too convenient. He had erased the evidence, believing himself safe, and yet, mere hours later, he was dead. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Someone else was still at play in this deadly game. A noise from the hallway made her turn sharply. Footsteps, quick and deliberate. Then the sound of the front door creaking. "Wait!" she called, but whoever it was had already fled. Miss Marple moved swiftly toward the entrance, stepping out onto the street. The night air was cool, but there was no sign of anyone in the dimly lit road. Whoever had been inside had vanished into the dark. Beatrice emerged behind her, arms wrapped around herself. "What now?" she whispered. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "Now, we tell the police." Inspector Crayford arrived within the hour, his usual gruff demeanor strained by the mounting complexity of the case. He stood over Dr. Langley's body, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You're certain it was poison?" he asked. Miss Marple gestured toward the overturned glass. "The symptoms suggest as much. Cyanosis, difficulty breathing. It was quick, but not instant. He must have realized what was happening." Crayford grunted. "And you didn't see who was inside?" "No," she admitted, "but they were there. They heard us." Crayford ran a hand down his face. First Ambrose, now Langley. If Langley killed Ambrose, then who killed him? Miss Marple clasped her hands together, deep in thought. Someone who was watching him. Someone who had just as much to lose. Crayford glanced around the office, then spotted something on the desk. A small folded slip of paper. "What's this?" he muttered, picking it up. He scanned the contents, then his brows furrowed. "What does it say?" Miss Marple asked. Crayford read aloud. "I know what you did. It's only a matter of time." He exhaled sharply. No signature. Miss Marple's mind raced. Someone had sent this to Dr. Langley before his death. A warning or a promise. "He must have received it earlier today," she murmured. That's why he was so desperate to destroy the ledger page. He knew someone else had figured it out. Crayford looked grim, and they made sure he wouldn't talk. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the empty glass. "Inspector, have you examined Dr. Ambrose's personal belongings? His letters? His notes?" Crayford frowned. "We've been through his papers, but nothing stood out." Miss Marple shook her head. Dr. Ambrose had a meticulous mind. He wouldn't have simply realized his mistake. He would have documented it. If Langley received this note, It means someone else had access to the same information. Beatrice, who had remained silent until now, spoke up suddenly. "The surgery records." Miss Marple turned to her. "What do you mean?" Beatrice swallowed. Dr. Ambrose kept his own set of records at the surgery, not just patient files, his private notes. He always kept them locked away. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Where?" "In the dispensary cabinet." Beatrice's face suddenly drained of color. "Oh." Crayford caught on immediately. "Where Langley had access." Beatrice nodded. If Dr. Ambrose wrote down his findings, Langley would have seen them, but if someone else found them first, they would have known exactly what he'd uncovered, Miss Marple finished, and they would have known what Langley was trying to hide. Crayford straightened. "We need to check those records. Now." Miss Marple turned to Beatrice. "Can you take us there?" Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But if someone killed Langley to keep that truth buried..." Miss Marple met her gaze. "Then we must get there before they do." Miss Marple and Inspector Crayford wasted no time. With Beatrice leading the way, they hurried through the darkened streets of St. Mary Mead toward the surgery. The night was unnervingly quiet, the usual gentle rustling of leaves seeming muted, as if the village itself was holding its breath. When they reached the practice, Beatrice fumbled with the key before pushing the door open. The reception area was just as they had left it, undisturbed, but thick with the sense of something unfinished. The three of them moved quickly toward the dispensary, where Dr. Ambrose had supposedly kept his private notes. Beatrice hesitated before opening the cabinet. If Dr. Langley went through this already, it might be empty. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. But if he didn't, the truth may still be waiting. Beatrice nodded and unlocked the cabinet. She let out a breath of relief when the drawer slid open, revealing a row of neatly bound ledgers and a collection of personal notes. Crayford immediately took out the most recent journal. This should have everything Ambrose was working on before he died. He flipped through the pages rapidly, then slowed, his brow furrowing. "Here," he said, turning the book so Miss Marple could see. "Look at this." The entry was dated a few days before Dr. Ambrose's death. Patient files cross-referenced. Symptoms aligned too precisely. Something is amiss. Medication batch issue or individual misdiagnosis. Must review all records for inconsistencies. If correct, this could have grave consequences. Miss Marple traced the words with her fingertips, deep in thought. He had found a pattern. Crayford scanned the previous entries. He was cross-checking his patients, but why? Beatrice leaned over. Dr. Ambrose was thorough. If he suspected something was wrong, he wouldn't stop until he found out the truth. Miss Marple flipped to an earlier page, her eyes narrowing at an underlined note. One patient's sudden deterioration prompted review. The same symptoms, same decline, must determine common factor. Something clicked in Miss Marple's mind. The names, the patients. The link was there, though it had been obscured. She turned the pages rapidly, noting a particular name repeated multiple times. "Mrs. Galbraith," she murmured. Crayford frowned. "The widow?" Miss Marple nodded. Her late husband had been one of Dr. Ambrose's patients. His death was attributed to natural causes, but look, Dr. Ambrose mentioned her here, separately. Beatrice looked closer. "That's strange. Mrs. Galbraith wasn't sick." Miss Marple tapped the page. "No, but her husband was, and so was another patient, Mr. Howard, and then another, Mr. Travers. All of them had seen Dr. Ambrose before their deaths. But do you see what's most unusual?" Crayford shook his head. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" "Their wives," she said simply. "Each of these men left behind a widow, and each widow remained in good health, despite living in close quarters with a supposedly contagious illness." The room fell silent. Beatrice's eyes widened. "You think their illnesses weren't natural?" Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Dr. Ambrose must have realized that their symptoms formed a pattern, one too precise to be mere coincidence. The men had all been patients of Dr. Langley at some point, meaning he could have had access to their treatments. What if he had been manipulating their medications, slowly poisoning them over time? Crayford's jaw tightened. Langley did kill Ambrose, but if he was silencing him because of this discovery, then that means— Beatrice gasped. Langley wasn't working alone. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Precisely. And I believe the true orchestrator of these deaths is still among us. A cold dread settled over the room. The sudden, meticulous murder of Dr. Langley now made perfect sense. Someone else had been controlling the game all along, ensuring that any loose ends were swiftly eliminated. Crayford snapped the journal shut. "We need to speak to Mrs. Galbraith." Miss Marple's gaze darkened. "Yes, but carefully. Whoever is responsible is more cunning than we realized." Crayford gestured toward the door. "Let's go." As they stepped outside, the night seemed even quieter than before. The village, with its charming cottages and peaceful roads, now felt like a stage upon which a sinister play had unfolded. And in that moment, Miss Marple realized something else. It wasn't just the pattern of the victims that mattered. It was the pattern of the killer. And she had just uncovered their next move. As Miss Marple, Inspector Crayford, and Beatrice made their way toward Mrs. Galbraith's cottage, the village lay in an eerie silence. The wind rustled through the hedgerows, and a stray cat darted across the road, vanishing into the shadows. St. Mary Mead, a place known for its quaint charm and civility, had been hiding something dark beneath its genteel surface. Crayford, walking briskly ahead, muttered, "If Mrs. Galbraith was involved, we need to move quickly before she realizes we're onto her." Miss Marple, ever the observer, shook her head slightly. "We mustn't rush, Inspector. We need to understand why, not just how. A person does not commit such crimes without reason." Beatrice's voice was hushed. "Do you think she killed Dr. Langley?" Miss Marple pursed her lips. "She, or someone acting on her behalf. Either way, the pattern suggests a crime carefully constructed over time. The question is, what did Dr. Ambrose discover that made him such a threat?" The answer came not in speculation, but in reality, as they arrived at Mrs. Galbraith's house. The windows were dark except for a single glow from inside. Crayford knocked firmly. A long pause followed before the door creaked open. Mrs. Galbraith stood before them in a dressing gown, her graying hair pinned back neatly. She did not seem startled, only mildly curious. "Inspector, and Miss Marple, what an unusual hour for a visit." Crayford's tone was measured. "May we come in?" She hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Of course, though I can't imagine what could be so urgent." The sitting room was warm, the scent of lavender and old books filling the air. Mrs. Galbraith gestured for them to sit, but remained standing herself. Miss Marple studied her closely. The woman was poised, but there was something just beneath the surface. A tension, a watchfulness. Crayford got straight to the point. "Mrs. Galbraith, we've discovered that Dr. Ambrose had concerns about certain deaths in this village, specifically those of your husband, Mr. Howard, and Mr. Travers." Her lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And of course, the fact that all their widows remain in excellent health." For the first time, a flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed Mrs. Galbraith's face. "Is that so remarkable?" Crayford's voice was firm. "It is when Dr. Ambrose suspected foul play." A long silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Galbraith sighed and moved to the fireplace, her fingers brushing against the mantelpiece. When she spoke, her voice was strangely calm. "You must understand something, Inspector. Women like us, widows, as you say, we are often overlooked, dismissed as grieving, fragile creatures. But we are neither fragile nor as helpless as people assume. Miss Marple nodded ever so slightly. No, I rather imagine you are not. Mrs. Galbraith turned to face them, her gaze cool but sharp. Do you know what it's like to live under a man's rule, Miss Marple? To be bound not by law but by expectation, to endure cruelty wrapped in civility, to be treated as a possession rather than a person? Beatrice inhaled sharply. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. I have seen many lives, my dear, and I have seen many forms of cruelty. Mrs. Galbraith's lips curled in something like a smile. Then you must understand why we did it. Crayford stiffened. We? She tilted her head. Do you really believe I acted alone? My husband, Mr. Howard, Mr. Travers, they were not good men, Inspector. They were respected, certainly, but behind closed doors they were tyrants. Men who believed that kindness was weakness, that their wives were little more than accessories. And when one of us, Mrs. Howard, dear Edith, found a way out, well, we saw an opportunity. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Langley helped you. Mrs. Galbraith's expression did not change. He understood. He saw what no one else did. A man of medicine, yes, but also a man of morality. His own kind of morality. He ensured their deaths were peaceful, painless. Just a slight alteration to their medications. Nothing dramatic. Nothing to raise suspicion. Crayford's voice was tight with controlled anger. You planned it. Mrs. Galbraith's eyes darkened. Would you have believed us if we had come forward, Inspector? If we had spoken of the bruises hidden beneath our sleeves? Of the whispered threats behind closed doors? No. We did what was necessary. Beatrice's voice trembled. But Dr. Ambrose... Mrs. Galbraith sighed. He started to suspect. He was a good man, but too stubborn for his own good. We tried to warn Langley to be careful, but he panicked. He acted rashly, poisoning Ambrose in his own tea, knowing no one would question a doctor's death by heart failure. Miss Marple's voice was steady. And then you killed Langley. Mrs. Galbraith did not deny it. He was losing his nerve. He would have broken, would have confessed everything. We couldn't allow that. Crayford stepped forward. Who is we, Mrs. Galbraith? Who else? She shook her head. I will not betray them. We have already suffered enough. Miss Marple studied her, a sadness in her eyes. And yet in protecting yourselves, you became something else entirely. Mrs. Galbraith's composure faltered just for a moment. We did what we had to, and now, I suppose you'll arrest me. Crayford nodded gravely. Yes, Mrs. Galbraith, I will. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled. Then let's be done with it. As Crayford escorted her from the room, Beatrice remained still, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, however, looked toward the fire, watching as the embers glowed softly. The true motive had not been greed, nor revenge, but survival, a twisted form of justice, born from years of suffering. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. Justice, she thought, was never as simple as it seemed. Miss Marple watched as the constable led Mrs. Galbraith away into the night, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows. The room seemed heavier in her absence, as though the weight of the truth had finally settled in. Beatrice sat rigid in the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes unfocused. Inspector Crayford exhaled, running a hand over his moustache before turning to Miss Marple. It all fits, he muttered, half to himself. The deaths, the missing prescriptions, Langley's involvement. But I can't shake the feeling that something is unfinished. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with a small sigh. That is because it is, Inspector. We are not quite at the end yet. Beatrice looked up sharply. What do you mean? Mrs. Galbraith confessed. She confessed to a conspiracy, yes, Miss Marple said gently. She confirmed what we suspected. Dr. Langley was involved in helping rid St. Mary Mead of its more unpleasant husbands. But ask yourself, my dear, was she truly the one who silenced Langley? Beatrice's lips parted, then closed again as a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Crayford frowned, but she admitted to it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Did she? Or did she merely allow us to believe it? The inspector's brows drew together. You mean— Miss Marple stood, smoothing out the creases in her skirt. I mean that Mrs. Galbraith was quite willing to take the blame, but something in her manner tells me she was protecting someone. The real killer. Crayford's face darkened. Then who? Miss Marple turned, her blue eyes sharp with certainty. The one who benefited the most, the one who never once faltered in her role, who played her part to perfection, all while letting others take the fall. Beatrice's breath hitched. You don't mean— Miss Marple's gaze landed on her, unwavering. Oh, but I do, my dear. Mrs. Howard. A silence fell over the room, thick with realization. Beatrice swallowed. But Edith, she was so distraught over her husband's death. She was the first to suggest something was amiss. Miss Marple nodded. And that was precisely what made me think of her. If anyone in this entire affair was in control from the very beginning, it was Mrs. Howard. Crayford's expression was grim. We need to bring her in. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. We need to catch her. An hour later, they sat in Mrs. Howard's drawing room, where tea had been served with perfect civility. Edith Howard, elegant in a high-necked dress of soft gray, poured milk into her cup, her hands steady. I must admit, I was quite surprised to hear about Mrs. Galbraith's confession, she said smoothly. Shocking, isn't it? Miss Marple studied her carefully. Oh, very much so, but one wonders, Mrs. Howard, why did Dr. Langley have to die? The cup paused just before reaching Edith's lips. A subtle moment, but Miss Marple caught it. She took a delicate sip before placing it back onto its saucer with precision. I imagine, she said lightly, that he knew too much. Miss Marple tilted her head. And you were the only one who knew just how much. A breath of silence passed. Then Edith Howard's lips curled into a knowing smile. Oh, Miss Marple, she murmured, you really are quite remarkable. Crayford stiffened beside her. Then you admit it? Edith chuckled softly. I suppose I must, though I must say I was rather hoping Mrs. Galbraith's confession would be enough to satisfy you. Beatrice looked stunned. You manipulated all of them, she whispered, even Mrs. Galbraith. Edith inclined her head. It was never about them, dear. It was about me. I was the one who had to endure the worst of it, the one who first discovered the idea of a gentle solution. The others, Galbraith, Travers' widow, even Langley, they were simply useful. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. But Dr. Ambrose was not useful, and neither was Langley once he lost his nerve. Edith's eyes darkened, her smile fading. Dr. Ambrose was a fool. He was going to expose everything, and Langley, well, he had served his purpose, but when a doctor begins to panic, he becomes a liability. Crayford's jaw clenched. So you killed him? Edith sighed. Yes, Inspector, I did. And I must say, it was almost too easy. A man so accustomed to handling medicines never questions a familiar scent or a slight change in dosage. Beatrice's voice was thick with disbelief. And you would have let Mrs. Galbraith take the fall? Edith's expression was calm. She was already complicit. A little more guilt on her conscience would hardly matter. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. And yet, Mrs. Howard, for all your cleverness, you made a mistake. For the first time, Edith's composure faltered. A mistake? Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. You see, it was your performance that gave you away. You played the grieving widow so convincingly, too convincingly. You were always the one to push suspicion, always the one to act first. And that, my dear, is what made me realize the true villain of this piece was never Langley or Galbraith. It was you. A flicker of something passed through Edith's eyes. Amusement, annoyance. Then, slowly, she exhaled, placing her hands in her lap. Well, she murmured, I suppose there's no point in denying it now. Crayford stood. Edith Howard, I'm placing you under arrest. She didn't resist. She merely smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I do hope you realize, Inspector, that I don't regret a single moment. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. No, she said softly. I rather imagine you don't. As the constables led Edith away, the room seemed to breathe again. Beatrice sat heavily, her hands shaking. She was right in front of us the entire time. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea. Yes, my dear, she said with a small sigh. Evil so often is. As the heavy oak door shut behind Edith Howard, the hush that settled over the drawing room felt almost unnatural. The air still carried the scent of freshly poured tea, but the warmth had long since dissipated. Miss Marple watched the last flickers of the fire in the hearth, the embers glowing faintly, like the dying echoes of a case that had finally reached its conclusion. Or so it seemed. Inspector Crayford rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping into his voice. Well, that was quite the confession. Beatrice, still pale, shook her head. It's almost hard to believe. Edith was so poised, so in control. Even in the end, she didn't seem remorseful. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Oh yes, she was in control, my dear. Right up until the moment she wasn't. Crayford sighed. At least it's over. We have her confession, the motive, the method. Do we? Miss Marple's voice, though quiet, cut through the room like the whisper of a blade. Both Crayford and Beatrice turned toward her. The inspector frowned. What do you mean? You heard her yourself. She practically laid it all out. Miss Marple stirred her tea absent-mindedly, the silver spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. Yes, she confessed to killing Dr. Langley, and yet something about it all troubles me. Beatrice shifted uneasily. But why? She admitted she was behind everything. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, sharp and thoughtful. Did she? Crayford exhaled, exasperation flickering in his expression. Miss Marple, forgive me, but you aren't saying we've got it wrong, are you? Oh, not entirely wrong, Inspector, just incomplete. A silence stretched between them. Beatrice swallowed. You mean there's something else? Miss Marple set down her cup with a soft clink. I mean, there's someone else. Crayford stiffened. Who? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Tell me, Inspector, have you ever known a true criminal mastermind to step so neatly into a trap, to confess so readily? Beatrice's lips parted, realization creeping into her expression. She wanted us to believe she did it. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly, my dear. Edith Howard is many things. Calculating, ruthless, clever, but she is not careless. Her confession, while seemingly damning, was just a little too polished. Crayford's frown deepened. But why would she confess if she wasn't the one behind it all? Miss Marple sighed. To protect the real killer. A heavy silence hung in the air. Then Beatrice whispered, Mrs. Galbraith. Miss Marple shook her head. No, my dear. Mrs. Galbraith was a pawn in all this, not a mastermind. No, the person we should be considering is someone else entirely. Someone who had access to all the victims. Someone who was never suspected because they were always present, always in the background. Crayford's eyes narrowed. You're saying... Miss Marple's voice was steady. Dr. Langley didn't act alone, and Edith Howard didn't kill him. She merely let us believe she did. Beatrice's breath hitched. But if not her, then who? A quiet knock sounded at the door. The room turned in unison as a maid stepped inside, looking hesitant. Begging your pardon, sir, but the constables have just brought in someone asking to speak with you. Crayford stood. Who? The maid hesitated. A nurse, sir. Nurse Talbot. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. but Beatrice gasped softly. "Nurse Talbot," Crayford gestured. "Send her in." Moments later, Nurse Talbot entered the room, her dark uniform crisp, her expression tightly controlled. She gave a polite nod. "Inspector, Miss Marple. I heard about Mrs. Howard's arrest and thought it best to come forward." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Come forward about what, my dear?" Nurse Talbot's hands tightened at her sides. "About what I saw." Crayford's eyes sharpened. "And what did you see?" Talbot hesitated, then straightened. "On the night Dr. Langley died, I saw Edith Howard leave his office." Beatrice inhaled sharply. Crayford's expression darkened. "That matches her confession." Miss Marple studied the nurse with quiet intensity. "Did you see her enter?" Talbot blinked. Well, no, but I saw her leave." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you see anyone else that evening?" The nurse's lips pressed together. "No." Miss Marple sighed. "You're quite sure?" Talbot hesitated. I don't believe so." Miss Marple's eyes didn't waver. "Tell me, Nurse Talbot, when Dr. Ambrose died, you were the one who prepared his medication, were you not?" The nurse's jaw tightened. "Yes, but that's part of my duties." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And when Dr. Langley was poisoned, was it not you who discovered him?" Beatrice's eyes widened. Crayford turned sharply toward the nurse. "That's true, isn't it?" Talbot's expression didn't change. "I'm a nurse. I tend to the sick." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And if someone were to ask about the medical records, about the prescriptions that went missing, who would be the one most able to alter them?" The air in the room shifted. Crayford's stance became rigid, his hand unconsciously moving toward his pocket. Talbot's voice was quiet. "I don't know what you're implying." Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Oh, but you do, my dear." A slow moment stretched between them. Then, in a blur of motion, Nurse Talbot's hand shot into her coat pocket. Crayford reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist before she could pull out whatever lay inside. A vial tumbled to the floor, rolling to a stop near Miss Marple's foot. She bent down and picked it up, examining the contents. "Ah," she murmured. "I do believe this is what was used on Dr. Langley." Talbot's chest rose and fell sharply, her composure cracking. "You don't understand." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Oh, but I do. Dr. Langley panicked, didn't he? He was going to expose everything, and Edith Howard, well, she would have been content to let him die of guilt. But you ensured it happened sooner." Talbot's face twisted. He was weak. "I did what needed to be done." Crayford tightened his grip. "You're under arrest." As Talbot was led away, Miss Marple exhaled. Beatrice, shaken, turned to her. "She nearly got away with it." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Yes, my dear. But the truth always has a way of revealing itself. Eventually." As the cold morning light filtered through the lace curtains, Inspector Crayford sat at the long oak table in the manor's study, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. The weight of the night's events still pressed heavily on his shoulders. The arrest of Nurse Talbot should have been the final act, the satisfying conclusion to a web of deceit. And yet something gnawed at the back of his mind, a whisper of doubt, a question left unanswered. Miss Marple, seated across from him, delicately lifted her teacup, her expression unreadable. Beatrice hovered near the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. No one spoke for a moment, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. Finally, Crayford exhaled. "We have Nurse Talbot in custody. The poison was on her, the means, the opportunity. And yet you don't look satisfied, Miss Marple." She set her cup down gently. "Because I am not, Inspector." Beatrice turned sharply. "But why? You said it yourself. Talbot had access. She tampered with the records. She even admitted to making sure Dr. Langley died." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh yes, my dear. She's guilty, of that there is no doubt. But tell me, does it not seem a trifle convenient?" Crayford frowned. "Convenient?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Consider the manner in which we arrived at our conclusion. Nurse Talbot was caught red-handed, the vial in her pocket, the confession under pressure. All very dramatic, don't you think?" Beatrice hesitated. "You think she wanted to be caught?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I think someone wanted her to be caught." Crayford's fingers stopped drumming. He sat up straighter. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She was never the mastermind. She was part of it, certainly, but there is another thread yet to be pulled. And I do believe we must pull it before it disappears altogether." Crayford cursed under his breath, rubbing his temples. "You're saying there's still someone else out there?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Not just someone, Inspector. The true architect of all this." Beatrice's voice was barely above a whisper. "But if not Talbot, then who?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "Someone who never once came under suspicion. Someone who ensured all roads led away from them. Someone who remained perfectly positioned to watch everything unfold and intervene when necessary." Crayford's gaze sharpened. "You have a name in mind?" Miss Marple took a breath, then exhaled. "Yes, Inspector. And I do believe if we act quickly, we may yet catch them before they slip away entirely." Beatrice looked between them, unease settling in her chest. "You think they're planning to escape?" Miss Marple gave her a small smile. "My dear, they already have." A tense silence followed. Then Crayford shot to his feet. "We need to move. Now." The manor, once bustling with whispers and movement, was eerily still as they hurried toward the guest quarters. The long hallway stretched ahead of them, its wooden floorboards groaning beneath their steps. A maid, startled by their urgency, dropped the stack of linens she had been carrying. "Where is Mr. Redfern?" Crayford demanded, his voice firm but controlled. The maid blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Mr. Redfern? Oh, He left early this morning, sir. Said he had urgent business in London." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but Beatrice saw the slightest tightening around her mouth. Crayford clenched his fists. "Damn it!" Beatrice's breath hitched. "But why him? He was barely involved. He only arrived halfway through the investigation." Miss Marple turned to her. "Precisely, my dear. He arrived just when we needed a new suspect, just when it was convenient to shift our attention away from Edith Howard and onto Talbot. Tell me, do you recall how often Mr. Redfern's name was mentioned before we met him?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, not much." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, when he did appear, he had knowledge of the case that should have taken him much longer to acquire. He asked questions that nudged us toward conclusions we might not have reached so quickly on our own. And more importantly, he always seemed to be present at precisely the right moment." Crayford's jaw clenched. He was controlling the investigation from the sidelines. Miss Marple sighed. "Yes, a gentle hand guiding us just enough, but never too much. And when it was time for the final act, he ensured Talbot took the fall while he disappeared quietly into the mist." Beatrice swallowed. "So he was the real killer?" Miss Marple's voice was soft. "No, my dear. He was the true orchestrator. He didn't need to dirty his hands with murder. He simply arranged for others to do it for him." Crayford turned on his heel. "We need to get to the station. If we hurry, we might catch him before the train to London departs." They rushed out of the manor, the cold air biting against their skin. The village streets were quiet, only the distant chime of the church bell marking the hour. They reached the station just as the engine hissed, steam billowing into the crisp morning air. Crayford ran ahead, scanning the departing passengers. Miss Marple and Beatrice followed, hearts pounding. "There!" Beatrice gasped, pointing toward the far end of the platform. Redfern stood near the carriage doors, his coat buttoned, a single bag in hand. He had not yet boarded, His posture relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. Crayford strode forward. "Mr. Redfern." Redfern turned, his expression betraying only the faintest flicker of surprise before smoothing into something unreadable. "Inspector," he said, his voice even. "What an unexpected coincidence." Miss Marple, ever composed, stepped beside Crayford. "Oh, I do believe this is no coincidence at all, Mr. Redfern." He tilted his head. "You sound as though you suspect me of something." Crayford's voice was tight. "We suspect you of orchestrating a series of murders, of manipulating an investigation, and of attempting to escape just as the noose tightens." Redfern exhaled a soft laugh. My, that's quite the accusation." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but you see, Mr. Redfern, it isn't an accusation. It's simply the truth." For the briefest moment, something shifted in his expression. Then, smoothly, he stepped forward, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Well done, Miss Marple. But you should know something." He smiled slightly. "You've caught me too late." Crayford grabbed his arm, but Redfern didn't resist. Instead, he simply looked past them toward the other end of the platform. Miss Marple followed his gaze and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. A second train was departing. A lone figure stood near the window of the last carriage, her face partially obscured by shadow. Beatrice's breath hitched. "Edith Howard." Redfern chuckled. "You always did underestimate her." Crayford's grip tightened. "You planned this." Redfern gave a small shrug. "Oh, Inspector, some people simply refuse to be caught." As Edith Howard's train disappeared into the horizon, Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Justice had been served, but not completely. As the train carrying Edith Howard vanished into the morning mist, Miss Marple let out a slow breath, her hands folded neatly before her. The station was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the remaining passengers dispersing and the occasional rustle of wind through the lamp-posts. Inspector Crayford still had a firm grip on Redfern's arm, though the man showed no intention of resisting. If anything, he looked amused, his lips curving ever so slightly. "Well, Miss Marple," Crayford muttered, his voice laced with frustration, "we got one of them." Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, Inspector." "We did." Beatrice crossed her arms, her expression tight. "But Edith got away." Redfern exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Got away?" "No, my dear. She did exactly what she was meant to do." Crayford's patience was wearing thin, and what exactly was that? Redfern's smile was almost imperceptible. "To remind you that true criminals, true masterminds, never truly get caught." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment before stepping forward, her voice calm but certain. "And yet, Mr. Redfern, even the most meticulous of criminals eventually find themselves at a disadvantage. A loose thread, a misstep, a detail they overlooked." His gaze flickered toward her, intrigued. "Do tell, Miss Marple. Have I overlooked something?" She gave a small smile. "Oh, not you, dear sir, but Miss Howard." She glanced at the tracks where the train had once stood, then back at Redfern. "Now, she may think herself untouchable, but she has made a crucial mistake." Beatrice frowned. "What mistake?" Miss Marple turned to her. "She ran." The weight of the words settled over them. "She ran," Miss Marple continued, "which means she believes she can still outmaneuver us, that she still holds the advantage. But a truly untouchable person does not need to run, my dear. No, Edith Howard has not won. She has merely postponed the inevitable." Redfern's expression remained unreadable. "And what do you propose to do? Chase her across continents? She's quite resourceful, I assure you." Crayford tightened his grip. "You'd like that, wouldn't you? Keep us occupied, send us on a wild chase while something else unfolds in the background." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against her chin. "Not at all, Inspector. That would be quite the distraction. No, we will not chase her." Beatrice blinked. "We won't?" Miss Marple smiled. Why chase a fox when you can simply wait for it to circle back to the henhouse? A beat of silence. Crayford's brow furrowed. You think she'll return? Oh, not here, Miss Marple mused. But somewhere. Someone like Edith Howard doesn't vanish forever. There will be another move, another scheme. And when the time comes, we shall be waiting. Redfern chuckled under his breath. Clever. Very clever, Miss Marple. But tell me, what will you do in the meantime? Simply wait by the fire with your knitting, hoping for a letter to arrive. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, my dear Mr. Redfern, you would be quite surprised at how much one can accomplish from the comfort of an armchair. Redfern shook his head in amusement. Then I suppose we'll see who outsmarts whom in the end. Crayford sighed, signaling to the waiting constables. Get him back to the station. As Redfern was led away, he didn't struggle, didn't argue. He merely looked over his shoulder one last time at Miss Marple, his expression unreadable. And then he was gone. Beatrice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So, that's it then. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. For now, my dear. But as with all things in life, nothing ever truly ends. Beatrice hesitated. What do you mean? Miss Marple looked up at the sky, the early sunlight breaking through the dissipating fog. I mean that mysteries do not conclude as neatly as we would like them to. Even when one door closes, another often creaks open. We may have solved this case, but do not be surprised if its shadow lingers longer than expected. Beatrice frowned. You think there's more to it. Miss Marple smiled, but there was something knowing in her gaze. I think, my dear, that some questions will always remain. And with that, she turned, making her way back down the platform as the morning stretched on, the world continuing as it always had, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered.